Chapter 3. Drannith could feel the eyes on her all the way to her father's office door. Officially, the Coppercoats had said nothing about what had happened, which only made things worse. Rumors had spread through the citadel and then the city, like fire ripping through dry grass, and at every step they got more exaggerated and spectacular. Drannith had no doubt people were now telling each other that Lukka had slaughtered a company of elite guards on his way out, escaping only after an epic fight with the general himself. She had no idea what they were saying, actually, because she was the one person no one would talk to about any of it. They just looked at her, then guiltily looked away when she caught them staring. Drannith was used to being watched. Growing up as the general's daughter meant her life had been lived in the public eye, but this was something else entirely. And now the summons she'd been waiting for to attend on her father. Now how much does he know? If he was aware she'd helped Lukka, that being a hostage had been her own idea, he would... Honestly, she had no idea what he would do. Strip me of my rank and lock me in a tower for my own protection, maybe. Or worse. He'd always had a temper, and his blood was up over this. Drannith didn't regret helping Lukka. Not exactly. But she wondered if they ought to have found another way. Too late now. Colonel Bride waited by the door, a broad, pitying grin on his face. Drannith hardened her features, pulling her professional mask firmly into place. "Colonel," she said with a salute, "the general asked for me." "He did." Bride opened the door and gestured. "After you, Captain." There wasn't an internal security detail waiting, which was probably a good thing. Her father was standing beside his desk, looking at the maps tacked to his wall. Drannith crossed the room and came to attention, aware of Bride's lurking presence behind her.
"Captain,"
Kudro said.
"you are well, I trust. You sustained no injuries."
"No, General," Drannith said. "I am fit for duty."
"Excellent. As it happens, I have an assignment for you."
Kudro appeared to notice Bride for the first time and made a shooing gesture.
"Leave us, Colonel."
Drannith saw the flicker of disappointment on Bride's face and suppressed the urge to shoot him a grin. The colonel saluted and left, closing the office doors behind him.
"This affair with Lukka is a bad business,"
the general said. He peered at the map a little closer, then turned away.
"I am glad that you were unharmed."
He doesn't know. Or at least, if he did, he wasn't saying. Drannith tried not to look relieved. "I don't believe Captain Lukka would actually have hurt me, sir."
"Because he loves you?"
It sounded odd to hear her father talk about love. He was more comfortable around words like loyalty, duty, and honor. She gave a cautious nod. "He does, sir. And he wants nothing more than to serve Drannith."
"And do you love him?"
Drannith blinked, confused. "Yes, sir."
"I see."
Kudro settled into his desk chair, his eyes boring into hers.
"Would that love ever prevent you from doing your duty as an officer?"
"No, sir," Drannith said stiffly. "However, the situation would not arise. As I said." Kudro held up a hand to stop her.
"I understand, Captain. Thank you."
Drannith gave an uncertain nod and waited. There was a moment of silence.
"Captain Lukka's escape is an embarrassment,"
the general said.
"for the military in general, and myself in particular. I am eager that the public learn as little of this affair as possible."
He sighed.
At the same time, recapturing the captain is absolutely vital.
I understood that he'd fled the city, sir, Jarina said. If so, then why not just let him be?
Unacceptable,
Kudro said.
Due to his position, Captain Lukka has extensive knowledge of Drannith's defenses, tactics, and capabilities. Exactly that sort of knowledge that would be catastrophic if a human were to ally with the monsters. Can you imagine the consequences?
I don't think Captain Lukka would turn against Drannith, Jarina repeated. And, in any event, the monsters aren't smart enough to take advantage of that kind of intelligence.
A year ago, I would have agreed with you. But something is changing.
The general's lips twisted.
Across the northern frontier, we have received reports of new kind of creatures, which seem to defy the traditional five-clade system of categorization. Stronger and faster than anything we've faced before. And most importantly, smarter as well.
I've heard nothing of this, Jarina said.
Nor should you have. The last thing we need is a general panic. But the monster that Captain Lukka interacted with was one of the new variety.
He shook his head.
This new communication between human and monster. Research is calling it bonding. May be related to the hybrid type creatures. Both appeared about the same time, though. We don't know if there's a further connection. There's a great deal we don't know, in fact, but the little information we have makes it clear this may be the biggest threat Drannith has faced in centuries.
Jarina stared, holding her expression rigid, doubt flickering at the bottom of her mind. Could father have been right about Lukka? She'd been so sure. But a whole new class of monsters. Even so, Lukka would never hurt me. He would never turn on Drannith. Whatever had happened was something that had happened to him. Some kind of magical accident.
Hopefully you see that this means Captain Lukka cannot be simply ignored,
Kudro went on.
If nothing else, we need him for study, to further our knowledge of this phenomenon.
I understand, sir, Jarina said.
To deploy regular forces to search for him would spread the knowledge of his escape beyond all hope of containment. I worry that it would be futile as well. As captain of the first specials, Lukka was naturally one of our most able soldiers. Instead, I've contracted a band of hunters to bring him in.
Hunters? Jarina let her contempt show. Are we really reduced to hiring mercenaries?
We have used hunters more often than you realize,
Kudro said.
They're often crude, but they are undeniably effective. They're also discreet and, where necessary, expendable. This band has performed a few low-profile tasks for us in the past, and I'm confident in their abilities.
He steepled his hands.
I'd like you to accompany them.
Jarina's eyes widened. Me, sir?
You know Lukka better than anyone, and you have full knowledge of the facts of this matter, which will help the information from spreading further than necessary. However,
his eyes narrowed.
If you are unwilling to take on the task, if you believe you would not be able to execute it to the best of your ability, then say so now.
Jarina stood for a long moment in silence, but in the end, there was no choice. If she didn't go, Kudro would send someone else. If we can capture Lukka, then maybe I can stash him somewhere. She should just have to be careful. Jarina gave a nod and saluted. Her father watched her with hooded eyes. very, very carefully. My name is Vivien Reid, and I am a traveler. I have come quite a long way. Lukka sat across the fire from the stranger who'd saved him and tried to make sense of it all. He was exhausted, and a brutal headache pounded in the back of his skull. Even by special standards, it had been a long day, with a desperate run across the city followed by a flight through the first ring with this unknown woman. At least, they hadn't gotten stopped at the secondary wall. The alert from the city hadn't been sent that far, so Lukka had simply flashed his uniform and walked out the gate. Even then, they'd kept on until wall and guards were out of sight, making camp in a belt of woods as the sun was setting. All day long, the pair of them had reserved their breath for running, barely exchanging a few words. Now, it seemed, she was ready to start explaining things.
About bloody time. I'm Lukka, captain of the first specials,
Lukka said.
I suppose I should thank you.
No need. You did not ask for my assistance.
Nevertheless,
he inclined his head.
But I have to ask why.
Vivien cocked her head, considering this. She was a tall, striking woman, with dark brown skin like Drannith's, and long, dark hair in a strange style, cut short on the right side of her head and pulled over her shoulder. Her clothes were odd as well, armor in an angular style with overlapping plates, and no monster warning crystals. The bow she carried was like nothing he'd ever seen, elaborately constructed from some material he couldn't identify. All in all, when she said she'd come a long way, he believed her.
She certainly doesn't look like anyone from Lava Brink or Skysail.
I have come to study your country, Vivien said. She had a trace of an accent, too, but one he couldn't place. I am what you would call an arcanist, although I do not follow any of the disciplines of your arcane core. Lukka nodded. That seemed clear enough. Only magic could have produced the strange translucent creatures she'd sent to his assistance, but none of the core arcanists had ever talked about doing anything similar. The day before yesterday, Vivien went on, I felt a great release of power. This flare of energy was of a type familiar to me, the energy of the natural world, of beasts and growing things. I was curious as to its source, and so I investigated. I found the farmstead where many had died in battle against a wild creature. From there, I traced the residue of the power to your city. I was making plans to track it further, but to my surprise, I found it coming to me.
I'm this source of power.
Lukka shook his head.
I'm not even an arcanist. I don't even know anything about magic.
Some magic is studied. Other varieties are inborn and come to the surface unpredictably. She looked at him with cool, intelligent eyes. You experienced something, didn't you? Something you can't explain.
I experienced something, all right, Lukka said bitterly, and it seems to have ruined my life.
Tell me. Lukka took a deep breath, then hesitated. But she had saved him at the gate. Recounting his story seemed like the least he could do. He repeated what he'd told Drannith, the farmstead, the fight, the strange moment of connection with the monster. And this is not common among your people, to bond with a wild creature.
I've never heard of it, Lukka said. General Kudro seems to think it makes me a traitor to humanity. Drannith got me out of the citadel just ahead of eternal security.
I see, Vivien shook her head. There is still a great deal I do not understand about this place, and the creatures of its wild.
Monsters, Lukka said. We call them monsters. And there's nothing to understand. They try to kill us, and we kill them.
Vivien made a non-committal sound and knelt forward to poke at the fire. Lukka sighed.
You still haven't explained why you helped me, he said.
Curiosity, she said frankly. The energy I sense from you is unusual. I wish to examine you for myself.
Wonderful. So now I'm a specimen.
A companion, rather, if you will have me, she shrugged. It would not be undue bragging to say that I can make myself useful.
And what would you want in return for this assistance?
Merely to accompany you for a time, she said. And I suspect irritate you with questions on matters you consider obvious.
Lukka snorted. Well, I'd be a fool to turn that down, under the circumstances.
May I ask what your plans for the immediate future might be? Lukka had been asking himself that all day. He closed his eyes for a moment, finding the ache in his head.
Drannith told me to lie low, until she can convince her father I'm not a traitor. But,
he shook his head.
It'll take more than that. I have to find that monster, the one that killed my squad. If I can bring the general its head, that should go a long way toward getting back on his good side. Not to mention, I owe the bloody thing for Gedra, Gox, and Nick.
He met Vivien's eyes.
You tracked me by this magical residue. Can you track it too?
I could, Vivien said. The power has weakened over time, so it may be more difficult.
Then that's a deal. Help me run this thing down, and you're welcome to come with me. I promise I'll answer whatever questions you have.
Vivien looked into the fire, considering. Lukka held his breath. He didn't want her to realize how much he needed her help. While he was trained in tracking monsters, flyers were notoriously difficult to follow, and the trail from the farmhouse would be cold by now.
Having a magical bloodhound on my side would be a big help.
Your proposition is acceptable, she said. At least for the moment.
Wonderful.
She wasn't telling him everything. That was clear. But it was enough for now. Lukka leaned back against the log and closed his eyes.
Wake me at first light.
It was indeed just after the moment that the sun had appeared over the eastern horizon that Vivien prodded Lukka gently. He started awake and took a moment to work out why he was in the woods in a filthy uniform instead of lounging in Jarina's bed. When memory came crashing down on him, he groaned. Are you well? Vivien said politely. She'd rekindled the fire and sat beside it, tending a small iron skillet on a wooden handle.
Just so,
Lukka said, getting to his feet. He looked over his sweaty, stained uniform and frowned. He hadn't had a chance to grab any kit when he'd fled the city, so he had only his sword and belt knife for weapons, and nothing in the way of wilderness gear. Vivien, on the other hand, seemed to be well equipped. He sat down beside her at the fire, and she handed him a canteen full of cool, clean water. He drank, gratefully, and when he was done, she gave him a wooden cup full of something steaming hot that smelled like boiled flowers. Whatever was in the skillet added notes of savory and sweet.
For someone who's come a long way, you're awfully comfortable in our forests,
he said, drinking the boiled flower stuff and watching the skillet hungrily. I have seen a great many forests, Vivien said. They are all different, but they also share a great deal. She gave a quiet smile. Magic helps as well. Poisonous plants have a distinct aura, and nutritious ones are quite different. She put the skillet back and scraped half of the contents into a bowl. Here, Lukka peered at the thin sliced stuff.
What is it?
Whatever I could find. Mushrooms, edible greens, berries, Vivien filled her own bowl and picked delicately at it with her fingers. I didn't wish to leave you alone for too long. With a shrug, Lukka followed her example and ate. The stuff was good, chewy and filling, though he couldn't help thinking it would have been a lot better with a nice bit of rabbit or chicken. When they were finished, Vivien carefully extinguished the fire, then led him to a nearby stream where they washed up and filled her canteen.
"All right," Lukka said. "What general direction are we headed?"
Vivien concentrated for a moment, eyes closed, then extended an arm northwest. That way.
"Figures."
The winged cat was headed out into the wilds, away from Drannith. If it had come in closer, someone would have found it already.
"Okay. I need to secure some gear and supplies, so we'll have to risk making contact with an outpost. There's one on the border of the third ring."
He glanced at the sky, which is mottled with shredded clouds.
"I'll need a tent too. If the weather turns, I don't want to be stuck out here in the wet. Do you have something for yourself?"
"I can manage," Vivien said with another slight smile. Lukka nodded.
"So outpost first. They'll have maps too. Then we can see if we can figure out exactly how far we're going to have to go."
"As you wish," Vivien said. "Lead on." The longer they spent together, the more puzzled Lukka was by his companion. He was clearly a wilderness expert, moving through forest and field alike with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent her life in the wild places. He quickly gave up trying to outpace her. She walked with such grace that she seemed to glide past any obstruction or undergrowth that left him stumbling. At the same time, though, the questions she asked would have shamed any Coppercoat ranker, and she didn't seem familiar with some things that everyone knew.
"Monsters?" Lukka said incredulously. "You want to know about monsters?"
Vivien nodded. He pursed his lips, not sure where to begin. Everyone in Drannith started learning about monsters from the time they could talk.
"I mean, they're monsters, right?" Lukka said lamely. "They're usually big and mean, and they destroy human settlements whenever they can. That's why everyone gathers in sanctuaries like Drannith."
"All monsters are hostile?"
"Not all, I suppose. Some just ignore us, but even those can be dangerous. Some big dinosaurs only eat plants, but they'll step on your house if it's in their way just the same."
"And the crystals?" They were walking down a side road in the third ring, skirting most of the inhabited settlements. A nearby hill bore a crystal formation on its peak, and Lukka glanced up at it, following Vivien's gesture. It was reassuringly dark.
"What about them?"
he said. "They are connected to the monsters."
"They glow when monsters are close, if that's what you mean. Only sometimes, though."
The winged cat hadn't provoked a reaction in any of their warning crystals. "There must be more than that," Vivien said, half to herself. "For it to be otherwise would be too much of a coincidence. Monsters and crystals, neither wholly natural."
"They don't have monsters or crystals where you come from," Lukka said. "It must be a really long way off."
He'd never heard of a country without monsters.
"Across the oceans, maybe. On some little island."
"Not in precisely the same way," Vivien said. "There were great beasts, but they were fully part of the natural world. Your monsters are not."
"What makes you say that?"
"They are singular," Vivien frowned. "Animals are divided into species. You understand? Rabbits, pigs, horses, and so on, each reproducing itself. Plants as well. But each monster seems to be unique, a species unto itself. And I am told they change over their lifetimes."
"Sometimes, yeah," Lukka frowned. He'd never thought about monsters that way before. "They get bigger,
mostly. Or develop new horns, or scales, or whatever. The oldest ones are usually the most dangerous. From an ecological point of view, your country is impossible. Too many predators, not enough prey, and each hunter different from the rest. This is why I wish to study it more closely. Speaking from the point of view of the prey, Lukka said, I feel like I already know everything I need to. Understandable, Vivien said. I hope I have not offended. Lukka grunted. Let's find that outpost. The boundary between the third and fourth rings wasn't demarcated by any kind of fortification, but there were Coppercoat outposts at regular intervals, serving as bases for the soldiers who patrolled the border and responded to emergencies. Lukka headed for the closest of these, hoping that, like for the guards and the secondary wall, word from the city about his defection wouldn't have reached any of the patrolmen. His luck held, and the lieutenant who was in command of the place went wide-eyed at the sight of one of the legendary specials. Lukka requisitioned a fresh uniform, keeping his old one as a spare, and a pack full of wilderness gear with rations for an extended journey. It made for quite a heavy load, but Lukka figured it might be a while before he had the chance to resupply. Vivien waited outside the little fort, rejoining Lukka when he emerged in fresh clothes. You have finished your business, she said. Lukka nodded. We shouldn't hang around too long. No telling when Kudro will get the word out to these little outposts. Once we're out past the fourth ring, we won't have much to worry about from Coppercoat patrols. Monsters, on the other hand, are another matter. The monster you seek does not seem to be moving. At least, not quickly, Vivien pointed. I sense it in that direction, though it is still some distance off. Let me know if we start getting close. The last thing we want is it flying off again, so we'll have to plan our approach carefully. Vivien gave a careful nod. It was late afternoon when they ran into trouble, and they were well out into the fourth ring. The shepherds were gathering their flocks and taking them back into the third ring, and the loggers had long ago headed for home. It was possible, Lukka reflected, that there wasn't a human being ahead of them for hundreds of miles. Closer to the city, he made a point of staying away from the major highways to keep out of sight, but out here he let Vivien lead the way. She had a knack for finding the easiest route along streambeds or game trails, skirting the worst hills or tangles of forests. They were just cresting a ridgeline when Lukka felt a pulse on his shoulder and saw a flash of light in his warning crystal. He dropped to one knee and gestured Vivien to get down. A problem? She said. Monster. Out there, somewhere. He scanned the surrounding terrain, then looked at the crystal again. The light was getting brighter. Hopefully it'll miss us. Stay quiet. Vivien nodded. She drew her bow and took an arrow from the quiver that rode over her shoulder. Lukka slowly shrugged off his heavy pack and worked his knuckles against the hilt of his sword. Trees swayed at the base of the ridge, and something big broke through, climbing the slope, trailing a cloud of dust. It was headed right for them, fast enough that there was little doubt it had seen them already. Damn, I suppose our luck had to run out sometime. Lukka gave the thing a clinical once-over, old training kicking in. It was dinosaur-clade, with 6 legs and a bony crest at the back of its head, sporting long spines. A long, viciously curved beak reminded him of a bird of prey. Pebbled, leathery skin stretched back along its flanks, and 2 tails curled independently, each tipped with a mace-like ball. The first thing they taught you in the Coppercoats was never to face a monster alone. Monsters are bigger, stronger, and meaner than any human being. Lukka had taught that to recruits himself. The only reason we survive is because we can work together. And yet, here he was, his team dead or gone, with only Vivien for backup. Lukka took a deep breath and drew his sword. I will halt it, Vivien said. That should give you an opening to strike. Halt it? Lukka said dubiously. The thing was gaining speed as it crested the ridge, coming with the momentum of a runaway cart.
How?
Trust me, Vivien knocked an arrow. No time to do anything else. Lukka dropped into a crouch, facing the oncoming monster and waited. Vivien let the arrow fly. Almost as soon as it left her bow, it began to crackle with green energy. Torrents of power shifting and coalescing around it into a massive shape. It was a huge beast, translucent green, like the pig and the elk, but many times larger. A four-legged creature with a long trunk, massive tusks, and a shaggy fur coat. It came into being at a full gallop, heading directly for the monster. The arrow, flying slightly ahead of the beast, struck the monster's bony armor and glanced away. But a moment later, dinosaur and arcane creation collided with a titanic bellow and a spray of green sparks. The monster's horns dug into the shaggy beast's chest, deep enough that they would have drawn blood on an actual creature. Instead, green magic crackled across the two giants. The beast's tusks scraped against the dinosaur's flanks, not penetrating its scaly armor, and its trunk slammed and flailed against the monster's eyes. The impact, though, had stopped the dinosaur dead in its tracks, just as Vivien had promised.
Which I suppose is my cue.
Lukka broke into a run, approaching the dinosaur from the side. The beast's assault was an excellent distraction, and he closed in easily. Bony protrusions on the monster's knees provided a convenient handhold. He jumped, took hold with his free hand, and swung himself up onto its flank. All 6 legs strained and shifted, shoving the thing against Vivien's beast. Lukka pulled himself up to the shoulder, where legs met body, and braced his feet against the scales.
Joints are always vulnerable.
Another thing they taught to recruits. Anybody that had bones and needed to shift and bend, which, to be fair, didn't include some elementals and nightmares, had weak spots where those bones came together. When facing something 20 times your size, a weak spot was often the only place you could do damage at all. With a yell, Lukka slammed his sword into the monster's hide, point down. The steel point bit through the scales and sank into the meat beneath, cutting and tearing until it shuddered against bone. Lukka yanked the blade free, and a gush of blood came with it. The monster shook with rage and pain, but he'd expected that, and it kept his footing. The green beast bellowed and slammed into the dinosaur again, holding its attention long enough for Lukka to steady himself for another strike, and then another. Finally, the creature had had enough. It twisted free of the beast's tusks and reared up on its back legs, giving a titanic heave that sent Lukka flying. Reflexively, he gathered himself into a ball, rolling when he hit the grass and popping back to his feet. The monster, dragging 2 legs on one side, was retreating down the hill, trailing gouts of blood. Lukka struggled back to his feet and retrieved his sword. Vivien fastened her strange bow over her shoulder, while her beast melted away into motes of green light.
It won't get far,
Lukka said, looking at the blood trail.
Come on, we can catch up and finish it off.
I will not, Vivien said calmly. If you wish to part ways, I wish you good fortune.
We can't just leave it,
Lukka said. Why not? Vivien said.
Because it's a monster.
Lukka felt like he was speaking to an idiot child.
And it's wounded. If we leave it alone, it will heal, and someday, someone else will have to kill it.
That is the only possible outcome? That someone kills it.
Or else it kills some humans, and then that's on your head, Lukka said. You saw how it came after us. You were pretty quick with your bow then.
Every living creature has the right to defend itself, Vivien said. That includes you and me. But I will not slaughter something that is no threat to me, monster or not.
You...
Lukka stared at her, frustrated. He shook his head and slammed his sword back into its scabbard.
You don't understand how things work here. What my people have to do to survive.
I admit that I do not. It is one of the things I hope to learn.
Let's go.
Lukka took a last look at the fleeing monster as it returned to the woods. I want to get this over with. Dog's Breath rubbed the sticky leaf between his fingers, then took a sniff. Blood, he said. A monster, and it's fresh. And not too far out of our way either, Mized spread her arms in a great clatter of bone. What do you think, cowards? Cowards, Drina had learned, was just how Mized addressed her crew in general terms. It was one of many little eccentricities she'd had to get used to since they'd left Drannith. Though her current assignment was as a staff officer, Drina had done her share of field work earlier in her career, tramping through the wilderness to bring down monsters before they threatened the walls. She had never fooled herself that her path had been as hard as most in the Coppercoats. No one ever forgot who her father was, but she liked to think she'd pulled her own weight. She remembered those expeditions as quiet and professional. Her squad had operated as a team, with everyone knowing their assigned task, while taking general direction from their captain's orders. They hadn't grumbled or complained, and personal drama had been kept to a minimum. Mized's hunters were not like that. Drina had guessed that any group of professional monster slayers had to have at least a basic level of competence, and she'd been right after a fashion. The hunters carried plenty of weapons, and certainly seemed to know how to use them. Apart from that, though, they couldn't have been more different from a Coppercoat squad. They wore no uniforms, openly defied orders, and bickered and insulted one another constantly. One thing that they had in common was that they all cultivated a ghastly appearance. Mized, for example, wore a steel mask that covered most of her face. The left side of her features, which the mask left visible, bore a horrible burn scar, the flesh lumpy and discolored from her hairline down to her chin. Her armor was decorated with bones, hundreds of them, hanging from wire hooks and clattering against one another whenever she moved. The blade she carried diagonally across her back was longer than she was. Dog's Breath, on the other hand, was a big, solid man with little in the way of ornamentation. His mask was a snarling hound, exquisitely detailed, which he hardly ever took off. He was their tracker and trapper, with 100 clever, cruel devices strapped to his side or hidden in his pack. The other three were Toothcracker, a huge man in steel-banded leather who fought with a maul made from a monster's giant tooth. Cedra, a half-mad arcanist whose mask was a laughing skull. And Nightshade, a skinny young woman who specialized in lures and poisons. Drina had so far managed to avoid saying much to any of them beyond a few pleasantries. Now she spoke up, hesitantly. "We need to catch up with Lukka," Drina said. "He's moving quickly. If we take a detour, we may not be able to." "We're all excited about the prospect of delivering your crush back to the General," Mized said, the visible half of her mouth quirking into a cruel grin. "But that doesn't mean we can't afford to pass up an easy kill. Not all of us have a lifetime meal ticket at the Citadel, eh?" "I say take the kill," Dragon's Breath said. "I can always pick up Lukka's trail again afterward." "Take it," Toothcracker boomed. "Me bored. Need to hit something." "There's a way in there," Sidra said, and giggled behind her skull mask. "Find it, and we'll find the spectre, and then—" "Shut up, you bloody lunatic," Nightshade spat. "I say, take it. That's 4 votes to 1. With 1 too bloody out of her skull to count." "Fair's fair," Mized said, looking back at Drina. "You can stay behind if you like." "I'll stay with you," Drina said. "Otherwise, gods know where you'd wander off to." "Father, what have you gotten me into?" Coppercoats said that there had to be a little bit wrong with someone if they became a hunter. After all, Drannith's military was ready and willing to welcome anyone who wanted to defend humanity from monsters. While not every recruit could hope to be a part of the specials or reach the heights of some other prestigious branch of the service, bodies were always needed to man the walls, patrol the forests, or work in the forges and fletcheries. Every schoolchild in the city learned that all hands were needed to keep the threat at bay. In spite of that, there were those who chose to strike out on their own, to take the fight to the monsters on their own terms. Some were foreigners who drifted to Drannith because the Coppercoats paid good bounties. Others were those whose temperament made them ill-suited to military life, which was a more polite way of saying criminals and madmen. The Coppercoats tolerated them as long as they stayed out of the city proper, because any dead monster had to be a good thing for humanity as a whole. Hunter bands often spent as much time fighting one another as they did hunting monsters, hence the emphasis on intimidating masks and other bravado. It wasn't unknown for one band to jump another and steal their kill, or even for a band to fall out amongst themselves and slaughter one another when there were particularly rich pickings to be had. Mized's group seemed more coherent than most, for whatever that was worth. They'd been together for at least a year, which was considered a long time in hunter circles, and while they might moan and protest, Mized's authority wasn't often challenged. In the day or so since they'd set out from Drannith, Jarina had followed along beside them, feeling like a visitor from another world in her neat coppercoat uniform beside their masks and ragtag gear. Now they were close to Lukka. He was only a half day ahead, according to Dog's Breath, and Mized had decided to veer from a direct pursuit to kill a monster her tracker had happened to smell. Part of Jarina was a little relieved, since she still wasn't sure what would happen when they actually caught up with Lukka. But either way, it was probably better to get it over with quickly. I need to get back to the city and start working on father. Nothing to be done about that now, though. Instead, she walked at Mized's side as the hunters followed Dog's Breath down a hillside toward a stand of trees marked with a splash of browning gore. Someone tore a chunk out of this thing, Nightshade said. Another monster, maybe?
Maybe.
Dog's Breath sniffed the air.
Don't smell any other beasts nearby.
It has bright little eyes, Cedra said. Watching. I'll pop them out and set them like jewels in my chain. Avant! She pointed. Beyond the screen of trees, a huge shape moved sluggishly.
About the damn time!
Toothcracker hefted his maul and roared, a deep, reverberating sound like his throat was made of steel. As it faded away, he charged. We all know you can shout, you bloody show-off, Nightshade said. No need to break everyone's eardrums. Jarina tensed and put her hand on her own sword, but Mized seemed unworried, even when the monster broke through the tree line. It was a six-legged dinosaur, limping badly on one side and unable to reach a gallop, but still a terrifyingly vast presence. Even Toothcracker, who was big enough that he made Jarina feel like a child, suddenly seemed tiny. The monster matched his roar with a shriek, its beak opening wide. Cedra gestured sharply, and bright light flashed in front of the monster's eyes, accompanied by a crack of thunder. The Arcanist's spell distracted the thing for a crucial half-second, enough time for Toothcracker to wind up and swing his maul overhand against its head. The huge weapon was simply a broken-off tooth from some much larger monster, lumpy and rough at one end and cracked at the other. It slammed into the dinosaur's bony crest with a crunch, breaking off one of its horns and leaving it staggering. Its beak snapped widely, forcing Toothcracker to take a hasty step back. Bloody idiot, Nightshade said. She'd unwrapped the sling, a long cord with a leather pocket at the end, and whirled it lightly over her head. Always ready to piss off something without thinking what happens after. She let fly, a clay globe arcing out and shattering squarely against the monster's remaining horn. Green liquid spattered across the thing, and almost immediately began to sizzle, scaled skin melting and bubbling beneath it. The dinosaur gave another shriek, this one in pain, and sank to its knees, desperately scraping its horn against the dirt. Drannith had a sour taste at the back of her throat, watching Toothcracker close in again and slam the creature in the side with his maul. She heard bones break, and the wretched thing flailed, unable to get back on its feet. The hunters were laughing, gathering around as it became clear there was no fight left in the creature. Sympathy for a monster was an unexpected feeling, but we never torture the things. They had to be killed for the safety of Drannith and all humanity. But even against monsters, there was such a thing as mercy. "Mized," she said, "get this over with. I don't want to have to tell the general you were dallying." Mized looked back. Her visible eye narrowed in irritation. But she unsheathed her great sword, a long, notched thing with a carved monster horn for a hilt, and gestured Toothcracker aside. The dinosaur lying on its side was breathing like a bellows, unable to do more than weakly paw the ground. Mized took position at the thing's throat, brought her weapon up in a two-handed grip, then swung it in the swift, heavy arc of an executioner's axe. The dinosaur gave a final plaintive shriek, then stilled. "Harvest the horns, leave the rest," Mized said to the others. Toothcracker and Nightshade looked sullenly back at Drannith, irritated to be deprived of their fun. "We wouldn't want to keep the general waiting." "It's close," Vivien said. "I can feel it. But we should camp and make our final approach in the morning." Lukka shook his head stubbornly.
"The longer we wait, the bigger the chance it takes off again. If it takes it into its head to fly away, we may never catch up to it. We'll take it now."
"I misliked the look on those woods." Vivien stared at the hill ahead of them, crowned with dense, interlocking trees, and a single crystal formation breaking through the branches at the peak. The last of the sun was quickly fading over her shoulder. "Something unpleasant dwells there."
"I thought monsters were just living things to be appreciated," Lukka said.
"Some of them ought to be appreciated from a safe distance," Vivien said. "In spite of what you may believe, I am not a fool."
"Well, I am going in. You're welcome to stay out here if you're frightened."
He started forward. After a few paces, Vivien fell in behind him. Somehow he doubted it was the cheap dig at her courage that motivated her.
"She wants to be there when I find this thing."
Why that might be, he had no idea. Fortunately, the dense canopy overhead kept the underbrush to a minimum, and they were able to push through the forest without much trouble. Lukka grinned in satisfaction when he saw a green spark bloom in the depths of his shoulder crystal, warning of a monster nearby. Vivien closed her eyes for a moment, then frowned. "It's on the move," she said, "getting farther away. Though not quickly."
"It can't be that far if the crystals are warning me," Lukka said. "Come on."
They walked side by side toward the summit. Vivien cleared her throat. "I thought you said the crystals did not warn you of this particular monster."
"That's true."
No one knew why some monsters were immune to crystal tracking, but it did seem to be an intrinsic ability. In which case, red eyes lit up the darkness. 4 pairs of them, stacked on top of one another, the characteristic alien shape of a nightmare.
"There's something else in here with us."
Lukka ripped his sword from his scabbard.
"Look out!"
The thing lunged out of the trees at head height. It was smaller than Lukka had expected, only the size of a cart, with a round body sprouting dozens of multi-jointed limbs on all sides. 8 eyes stared out from above a jaw thick with mismatched fangs, while a thick tail curled from the other end, trailing something gray and fibrous. Lukka dove one way, and Vivien went the other. The creature leapt from tree to tree, multiple legs reaching out in every direction to keep it from ever touching the ground. It shifted to follow Lukka, who gave ground, unable to reach it with his sword, and wishing profoundly that Nick was here with her crossbow. An arrow flashed up, sticking in the nightmare's oval body. The shaft was no more than a toothpick, doing little damage, but green light exploded out from it into the form of an ape-like creature with an extra set of arms where its legs ought to be. The ape thing clung to the nightmare and tore at it with 4 sets of long, translucent green claws. Lukka took the chance to get closer. Several of the thing's long, spindly limbs were within his reach, and he hacked at one, smashing it apart at the joint. The nightmare shifted, hissing in irritation, and spiraled up farther into the trees, temporarily out of sight in the canopy. Lukka tried to keep track of it by the flashes of green from Vivien's ape thing. "Now what?" he said. "I admit I am uncertain." Vivien turned in a circle, bow drawn, and knocked but without a target. "Perhaps a retreat is in order." "Where?" He was cut off by the ape thing, which fell screaming from the trees, a great hole torn in its midsection. It hit the ground and burst apart into a spray of green motes. At the same time, the nightmare descended, lowering itself on a dozen limbs, its tail curving underneath it. Vivien turned to shoot it, but the monster was faster, tail whipping forward. Vivien dodged, but the nightmare's tail left a trail of floating gray fibers behind it. She managed to avoid the blow, but the trail snagged her, gray threads suddenly pulling tight on contact like a hunter's snare. They coiled around her, trapping one arm against her body, and the nightmare brought its tail back around. The second pass left Vivien completely enmeshed in the gray stuff, struggling hard against innumerable sticky fibers. "Gods above!" Lukka gripped his sword tight enough that his knuckles stood out white, and the nightmare, apparently satisfied with its cocoon, turned in his direction. It spread its jaw wide in a soundless scream, then dropped toward him, legs flickering from tree to tree, too fast to follow. "Wait until it gets close. Strike, then dodge." He almost made it. Years of fighting monsters had honed Lukka's reflexes to a razor's edge, and he timed his thrust perfectly, letting the nightmare's own momentum do most of the work of impaling it on his blade. The sword stuck fast, buried in the thing's flesh just behind its head, and Lukka let it go, throwing himself to one side to avoid the snapping jaws. He escaped the fangs, but one of the thing's cursedly fast legs slammed into him, taking him in the stomach and knocking the wind out of him. He hit the ground, gasping for breath, as the nightmare turned toward him, and Vivien struggled helplessly. "Maybe it's for the best." Lukka stared up into the wide, slavering jaws and tried to face his death stoically, like a proper Coppercoat. "I got my squad killed. What right do I have to survive that? Now Drannith won't have to endanger herself protecting me from the General. I'll just disappear out here, and no one will ever know. Why?" Something uncoiled in his mind, a set of sensations that were not his own. His wings tucked back against his sides as he dove, the wind whipping through his fur. The canopy exploded in a storm of flying leaves and branches. The winged cat, the monster that had torn Lukka's squad to pieces, broke through bits of wood snagged in its brown and white fur. It slammed into the nightmare with both forejaws, claws leaving long rents in its black skin. The multi-legged monster twisted and failed, tail trailing long silky strands, but it couldn't get a hold before the winged cat bit down on its neck, large saber teeth tearing free a huge chunk of meat. The nightmare twitched, writhing like a dying spider, and the cat straightened up, letting the rancid flesh fall. "You!" Lukka wanted to laugh and sob at the same time. It was right there, the thing that had ruined his life, and he was helpless. Vivien was still trapped, and his sword was buried under the corpse of the nightmare. He struggled to his feet, the cat watching him with huge, calm eyes, making no move to attack. "What's the matter?" he said, spreading his arms. "Why not kill me too?" It didn't answer, not in words, but he felt a surge of something, feelings, images, and sense of connection and belonging. He saw himself, tiny and white-hot with energy, waving his arms and making incomprehensible noises. You are bonded. Vivien had rolled onto her back and somehow gotten her hands on a knife. She was patiently cutting herself free, strand by sticky strand. Lukka, listen to me. This is the energy I felt. It connects you to this creature. You each feel what the other feels.
Why?
Lukka spat.
I never asked for this. I never wanted it. This thing killed a whole farmstead full of people. Killed my squad. And now it wants to be friends?
He turned back to face the cat.
Why couldn't you have just left us alone?
More images flooded into his mind, at a strength and intensity that left him reeling. He felt power, an alien, unimaginable power rolling out through the familiar waves of crystalline energy that flowed and shifted around the world. Through the cat's eyes, he saw a field of crystal glowing with a strange orange light, and when he came close, a voice seizing his mind and speaking with a compulsion that brooked no argument. Destroy the humans. Destroy their city. Destroy so-called civilization. Destroy, destroy, destroy. The compulsion settled over his mind, over the cat's mind, like a net forcing itself far from its usual haunts to search for the two legs and their strange hive. It fought them, taking injuries, going hungry, their flesh too full of bone and gristle to be nourishing, until finally one of them had reached out, and with a burst of power had blown the orange net into tattered fragments. Lukka, Vivien's voice was calm. Lukka, can you hear me? He opened his eyes and blinked. He was lying on his back on the floor of the clearing. Vivien, still cleaning the last of the clinging threads from her armor, sat beside him. A little ways off, the winged cat sat on its haunches, licking idly at one forepaw. Lukka tried to sit up and found his head spinning. He hastily sat back down.
I can hear you. Why do I feel like someone bashed me on the head?
A great deal of shamanic energy was released when the two of you came together. The effects will pass. Vivien bent closer. What did you see?
Crystals. Orange crystals.
Lukka's eyes narrowed.
They were forcing the monsters toward Drannith, I think. Causing them to attack the city.
Vivien frowned, as though she'd expected as much. What crystals?
There was a field of them, a pattern around a central structure.
Lukka tried sitting up and found he could manage it this time.
I know that place. It's called the Ozolith. It's north of here, far north. One of the biggest crystal formations on the plains, outside of Drannith itself.
Is it known for affecting the behavior of monsters? Vivien said.
Not that I've ever heard of,
Lukka said. He eyed the winged cat.
You think it's true? What that thing showed me?
I do not think it is capable of lying. Not to the one who holds its bond.
Gods above,
Lukka swore.
If that's true, we have to warn someone. I heard a voice. Someone spoke through the Ozolith, and they want Drannith destroyed. If they can make the monsters listen, the city needs to be ready.
From what you've told me, I don't think they will listen to you. Vivien removed the last piece of thread from her armor and got to her feet. My course, at least, is clear.
What course is that?
I must find this Ozolith and discover what is happening there.
Why?
Lukka glared at her.
What's your stake in all this? I thought you were just here out of curiosity. Why should you care if someone is making monsters attack Drannith?
I Vivien hesitated, then grabbed her bow and nocked an arrow. "Who's there? Show yourselves!" "Lukka?" Jarina's voice, absolutely the last thing Lukka had expected to hear. "It's me. Please don't run." For a moment, everything was frozen silence. A line of figures emerged from the darkened woods. One of them wore a coppercoat uniform. Jarina, her lovely face creased with worry. The others were monstrous silhouettes, spiked and barbed, masked in steel so they barely looked human. One carried an enormous maul on one shoulder, while another leaned on a wicked-looking great sword. Hunters. The mercenaries loved to decorate themselves with pieces of their kills, trying to look as intimidating as possible. What in the name of the gods is Jarina doing here with a pack of hunters? "Lukka," Vivien said, her bow still nocked. "Do you know these people?"
"Jarina is my fiancée," Lukka said. "The others are mercenaries, professional monster hunters."
"And why are they here?" "We've come to bring you back, Lukka," Jarina said. "Just put down your weapon and come with us." She turned her attention to Vivien. "I don't know who you are, but don't interfere, and you won't be harmed." "Yeah," said one of the hunters. "We'll take care of Lukka and his big, nasty cat. You just run along." "A pair," another said in a dreamy voice. "Two in one, a union of souls." The winged cat growled, a deep, resonant sound Lukka could feel in his gut.
"What's going to happen to me if I go back?" Lukka said.
"We'll work it out," Jarina said. "Father was angry when we left, but by the time we get back he'll have had time to think things over. I'll bring him around, I promise." Lukka swallowed. He ached to believe her. But something came at him from the right, fast, tearing through the air with a rapid whipping sound. Two weights connected by a long chain caught him around the legs and cinched themselves tight, sending him crashing to the ground. He shouted, and everything went to hells. "Stop!" Jarina was shouting at someone. He heard Vivien's arrow hit something with a thunk, followed by a deep ursine growl, more shouts, and a crackle of magic. The cat growled deep, then pounced, and there was a scream. "No!" Vivien's voice closer. "If you want to keep him safe, we must escape." Lukka rolled over. He saw Jarina crouched against the tree, looking back at him as the hunters fought a glowing green bear. Their eyes met, and she mouthed his name. Then the cat was standing above him, filling his vision. Vivien was there too, clinging to the fur on one side of the huge monster. It bent toward him, jaw open, and once again Lukka thought he was staring death in the face. Instead, the winged cat with infinite care hooked its long saber teeth through the tough leather of his uniform belt, lifting him in its jaws as though he were a kitten. It flared its wings and leapt. There was a moment of wild confusion crashing through the canopy of the forest, and then they were away, winging off into the night.